Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly Nyquist. This is video series, lecture number 2 on the origin of life. And what we're looking at is origin of life from a biblical parameter, but not just biblical parameter, but as seen from the non-Western perspective, because that would be the perspective most identified with the Hebrew culture. So how does that differ? Well, in this series, in part 2, we're going to look at a little different point of view. It would be the Western point of view, just incorporating a little bit. Now, why is that? Well, because this quote that I have up on the board here behind me, it says, the story of philosophy. Now, philosophy was a development of 600 BC, more or less, where there was a group of thinkers that wanted to do away with all the superstition, do away with all the gods and the spirits, and they wanted to think independently. They wanted to implement human reason. So let's look at that is the source of reliable knowledge, okay? What is our source of reliable knowledge? The non-Western would be an authoritative source of knowledge, external, whether it be biblical revelation or other. The Western development would be a source of knowledge that is within, that is generated through human reason, that is generated through observation. So what is the story of philosophy? The Story of Philosophy by Brian McGee. The change of reliable source of knowledge by the early philosophers. The early philosophers made a change of their source of reliable knowledge. And what was that change? Well, he says, Brian McGee, the first philosophers were making 2 great breaks with the past simultaneously. In the first place, they were trying to understand the world by the use of their reason, without appealing to religion or revelation or authority or tradition. Okay, so you see that? Is that they are assuming a different source of reliable knowledge. They are assuming, or they are doing away with authoritative knowledge, revelation, and tradition. That is authoritative. And so they're doing away with authoritative knowledge, which the majority of their world was based on, and they're saying, no, we're using human reason, no more gods or spirits or etc. Okay, so there was a change. And what that just says is the source of reliable knowledge is important, and it's a basis of all of our thinking processes, whether we know that or not. That is what happened. Okay, so what did that change produce? Well, let's look at what that change produces. There was a gentleman, Henry Fairfield Osborn. He published a book, From the Greeks to Darwin, in 1894. Now, he was a curator in a museum, Natural History Museum in Chicago, Illinois, and he was setting up the displays, evolutionary displays of the origin of man. And so he was wanting to document the evolutionary theory. And this is in 1894. What he thought he was going to do was going to get to Charles Darwin, pretty much, in his publication of his Origin of Species in 1859. So that there was only going to be 40 years or 30 years of history. But what happened? Well, the name of his book is From the Greeks to Darwin. So now you can see how far back he had to go and where he ended up. So development of theory. So what did he find? Well, what he found is Thales of Miletus in about 640 BC to 546 BC, in that area. Thales believed water to be the source of all life, that where there's water, there will be life. And that is pretty much a thesis or a basic belief that we still operate on today. And that's why the Mars probe has been sent, and it's looking for water. Thales is what proposed water to be the source of all life. If there's water, there can be life. Okay, Anaximenes in 611 BC. He proposed that terrestrial slime, when heated by the sun, directly produced plants, animals, and man. So Anaximenes, and now we have slime, so it's water, it's mud, it's really of a slurry. When heated by the sun directly, produces animals, or plants, animals, and man. Interesting thought processes. Third one, I don't know exactly, Xenophanes is what I would call him, but 576 BC to 480 BC, he believed life was a product of spontaneous generation. What that means is life came from non-life. Over time, that life showed up from non-life. We have in other words, these philosophers are saying, okay, what is our source of reliable knowledge? It's human reason. It's human-centered. It's humanism. And how did we get here? Where did life come from? Well, it came through natural processes. It involves water. It involves mud. It involves slime. And then it involves the spontaneous generation of life from non-life. These are in 500 BC, based on their first assumption, their primary source. And what was that? Do away with authority. We're basing it on human reason, humanism. So that was, okay, here's a few others. Empedocles, 495 BC to 435 BC. He proposed that the development of life was a gradual process. It wasn't just plants, animals, and then man, or showing up boom like this. But he says a gradual process. First plants, then animals, and finally man. So it was in order. Now you can see kind of the Western thinking process kicking in, where it's linear and it's in line and it's going upwards towards perfection. And that is a Western trait of thinking. Okay, the imperfect forms were gradually replaced by the perfect forms by survival of the fittest. Interesting. Competition, that's Western. Whereas certain forms, instead of being protected and helped, certain forms are eliminated because they aren't strong enough, they aren't have enough population. So what Empedocles is proposing is pretty much what modern day biology proposes also. Modern day biology based on scientific naturalism. Aristotle, he developed the concept of the single chain of evolution from the most simple to the most complex, from the polyp to man. Okay, so that is pretty much when you change your source of reliable knowledge, it pretty much dictates your basic beliefs, your methods, and your model of science. So in other words, the model of science hasn't really changed since 600 BC. When you establish the base of thinking, you pretty much then get the rules out of that base, and from the basic beliefs, basic rules, then you form a model, a habit, a prejudice, and you're looking at the world through that prism, through that looking. So interesting that how far back can the evolutionary theory be traced? As far back as the thinking of man that says this is the way it is. I want to go with human reason. I close off, close the system, and it's based on natural laws. By the 1700s, around the time of the French Renaissance, there were recipes available recipes available for one to generate life from non-life. Excuse me. Okay, so there was recipes. And what were one of the recipes? One such recipe consisted of taking a sweaty old shirt, wadding it up in the corner of a barn, and then adding corn to it. It was guaranteed to produce mice within 21 days. In 1859, the French Academy of Sciences sponsored a competition awarding awarding the experiment that either proves or disproves the theory of spontaneous generation. That is, of life arising naturally from non-living matter. So in other words, a closed system depends on spontaneous generation. So in 1859, there was a contest. Okay, for once and for all, we're going to prove. And I think that what they thought they were going to prove is that spontaneous generation was true, because that's what the Academy of Sciences was based on, especially the French Academy of Sciences. But what happened? Well, Louis Pasteur won that competition, demonstrating that life only comes from life, thus disproving the theory and the concept of spontaneous generation. But if you have a closed system, and without God, without any divine power to come into that system, spontaneous generation is the only model, is the only hope that there is. Otherwise, if spontaneous generation doesn't work, then you have to open the system. And for those that want to maintain a closed system because of their beliefs, spontaneous generation has to work. Spontaneous generation is what they have to do. So that's what we have. In 1883, Frederick Engels wrote, "Pasteur's experiments in this direction are useless. For those who believe in their possibility, he will never be able to prove the impossibility by these experiments alone. But they are important because they furnish much enlightenment on these organisms, their life, their germs, etc." Okay, you get it? Is that our science model is based on a belief system. And that belief system is based on a source of reliable knowledge. So in other words, Louis Pasteur's experiment showing that spontaneous generation was dead in the water, it didn't change Frederick Engels' mind. Pasteur's experiments in this direction are useless for those who believe in their possibility. What do you believe? What do I believe? Am I adopting another belief that I believe is true, but it's really not? It's just someone's belief system? Spontaneous generation has to be true to keep a closed system. But is it true scientifically? No. It is not something that's scientifically sound. There's scientific law, the law of biogenesis. Life, bio, where does it come from? It comes from other life. It comes from life itself. So where does life come from? Well, that's what we're going to be getting into in the origin of life. Again, we're Tim and Holly. If you would like to communicate with us, it's through doubleroadrover.com or through thn.academia@gmail.com. Again, thank you for joining me. This is part 2. And we have 6 parts to this video series. So I hope you stay with me. Thanks again.